The sun clawed at the earth, scorching the cracked clay until it bled dust. Her boots scuffed through the brittle remains of grass, each step a small defiance against the heat that pressed her down. Eliza's hands trembled, clutching the frayed edge of her shawl, her knuckles raw from days of gripping reins that no longer existed. The wagon was gone, taken by men with hard eyes and promises that turned to ash in her mouth. They'd left her with nothing but a name scratched on a scrap of paper and a single $1, crumpled like her hope. The horizon shimmered, mocking her with its endlessness. She swayed, her stomach a hollow ache, her lips cracked and tasting of salt. The air smelled of baked stone and despair. Somewhere, a hawk screamed, its cry slicing through the silence like a blade. She sank to her knees, the ground burning through her skirt. Her fingers dug into the dirt, searching for something solid, but it crumbled under her touch. The world felt like it was unraveling, and she was just a thread caught in the wind. 3 days ago, she'd been promised a new start, a homestead, a life carved from the wild. Instead, she'd been abandoned in this godforsaken stretch of Nebraska, where even the shadows seemed to shrink from her. The paper in her hand fluttered, the name on it, Jacob Wells, a stranger who was supposed to meet her, supposed to be her future. But the stagecoach had rolled on, and no one had come. No one called her name. Her breath hitched, a sob she refused to let free. She pressed her forehead to the earth, the heat searing her skin, grounding her in its cruelty. She thought of her mother's hands, rough from years of scrubbing floors, braiding her hair with a tenderness that felt like a dream now. "Keep going, Eliza," her mother had whispered before the fever took her. "You're stronger than the world thinks." But the world didn't care about strength. It chewed up promises and spat out bones. She lifted her head, squinting against the glare. A faint rumble stirred the air, not thunder, but hooves. Dust rose in the distance, a smudge against the sky. Her heart stuttered, caught between fear and a flicker of something reckless, something like hope. The town appeared like a mirage, its wooden buildings hunched against the wind. She stumbled toward it, legs heavy, the $1 now damp in her fist. The auction yard was a chaos of noise, men shouting, horses snorting, the clatter of crates. A crowd gathered around a makeshift platform, their faces weathered and grim. Eliza pushed through, her shawl catching on a splintered fence. On the platform stood a man, his head covered in a burlap sack, hands bound behind him. The auctioneer's voice boomed, $2 for the lot. "Strong as an ox, they say." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but Eliza's eyes fixed on the man's broad shoulders, the way they slumped, as if carrying a weight heavier than chains. She didn't know why she raised her hand. Maybe it was the $1 burning in her palm, or the way the man's stillness mirrored her own. $2, she called, her voice thin but steady. The crowd turned, their stares pricking her skin. The auctioneer grinned, slamming his gavel. "Sold to the lady in the shawl." She felt the weight of their eyes, the judgment in their silence. Her $1 was gone, and now she owned a man, a stranger with a sack over his head. Her stomach twisted, but she stepped forward, her boots scraping the dirt. The auctioneer yanked the sack off, revealing a face carved from hardship, a jagged scar across his cheek, eyes like storm clouds, and a name she hadn't expected. "Jacob Wells," he said, voice low, rough as gravel. Her breath caught, the paper in her hand suddenly heavy. The name she'd carried across the plains, the name that was supposed to be her salvation, now stood before her, bound and bought for $2. His eyes met hers, not with gratitude, but with a wariness that mirrored her own. The crowd dispersed, leaving them in the dust, two strangers tied by a name and a debt neither could pay. The dust settled around them, a thin veil that stung Eliza's eyes. Jacob stood motionless, his wrists still bound, the rope biting into his skin. His gaze lingered on her, not pleading, but searching, as if trying to unravel the why of her bid. She felt exposed, her shawl too thin against the weight of his stare. The auctioneer tossed her the rope's end, a coarse lifeline she hadn't asked for. Her fingers closed around it, trembling, the texture rough as the choices she'd made to survive this far. The town's noise faded, hooves, shouts, the creak of wagons, until it was just them, two shadows cast long across the cracked earth. She led him to the edge of the yard, her steps uneven, his boots heavy behind her. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruises of orange and purple. Her mind churned, pulling her back to the letter that had brought her here. Jacob Wells, homesteader, seeks a wife. Land to share, life to build. Words penned in careful ink, promising shelter, purpose. She'd clung to them through nights of hunger, through the betrayal of the men who'd taken her money and left her stranded. Now, the man tied to her was no savior, just a stranger, bought like livestock, his name a cruel coincidence or a cosmic jest. They stopped near a sagging fence, the wood splintered and gray. She turned to face him, her breath shallow. "Why were you up there?" Her voice cracked, barely louder than the wind. His jaw tightened, a flicker of shame crossing his face before it hardened again. "Debts," he said, the word clipped, heavy as a stone. "Couldn't pay. They took what they could." His eyes dropped to the rope, then back to her. "And you? Why'd you spend your last coin on me?" She wanted to say it was the name, the letter, the hope she'd nursed like a dying flame. But the truth was Messier, a tangle of desperation and defiance. "Didn't have anywhere else to spend it," she said, her lips twitching, not quite a smile. He snorted, a sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so brittle. She reached for the rope, her fingers fumbling with the knots. His hands, freed, flexed slowly, as if remembering their own strength. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to. The memory came unbidden, sharp as a blade. Her father, drunk and swaying, his voice slurring promises he'd never keep. "I'll come back for you, Liza." He hadn't. The house had grown quiet after he left, her mother's songs replaced by coughs, then silence. Eliza had been 16, scrubbing blood from her mother's handkerchiefs, learning that love could be a wound that never closed. She blinked, the memory dissolving into the present, Jacob's scarred face anchoring her. He was no father, no husband, not yet, maybe not ever. But he was here, and that was more than she'd had an hour ago. They walked toward a boarding house, its sign creaking in the wind. Her stomach growled, a traitor announcing her hunger. Jacob glanced at her, his eyes catching the way her hand pressed against her ribs. "When'd you last eat?" he asked, his tone gruff but not unkind. She shrugged, unwilling to admit the truth. He stopped, pulling a small, dented tin from his pocket. "Jerky," he said, offering it. She hesitated, pride warring with need, then took a piece. It was tough, salty, but it steadied her. They stood there, chewing in silence, the act strangely intimate in its necessity. The boarding house door groaned as they entered. The woman at the counter eyed them, her gaze lingering on Jacob's scar, Eliza's frayed shawl. "One room left," she said, voice flat. $2 a night." Eliza's heart sank, her dollar was gone, her pockets empty. Jacob stepped forward, his hand brushing hers as he dropped a coin on the counter. "We'll take it," he said. The woman raised an eyebrow but said nothing, sliding a key across the wood. Upstairs, the room was small, the air thick with the scent of dust and old straw. A single bed sat against the wall, a silent challenge. Eliza's pulse quickened, but Jacob turned away, spreading his coat on the floor. "Take the bed," he said, not looking at her. She nodded, too tired to argue, her body sinking into the thin mattress. The darkness was heavy, but his breathing, steady and slow, was a tether in the night. Morning came like a blade, slicing through the thin curtains with a light that burned Eliza's eyes. She woke stiff, the mattress a grudging host to her aching bones. Jacob was already up, his coat folded neatly by the door, his back to her as he stared out the window. The glass was smudged, framing a town that looked as weary as they did, wooden facades leaning into the wind, streets choked with dust. His silhouette was rigid, the scar on his cheek catching the dawn's glow like a seam of quartz in rough stone. She sat up, her shawl slipping, and felt the weight of the letter in her pocket, its edges worn from her restless fingers. They didn't speak as they left the room, the silence between them thick but not hostile. Downstairs, the boarding house keeper handed them a plate of dry biscuits and a tin of coffee, her eyes flicking between them with a curiosity she didn't voice. Eliza's hands shook as she took a biscuit, the hunger gnawing sharper now. Jacob ate slowly, his movements deliberate, as if measuring each bite against some private debt. She watched him, wondering what had carved that scar, what debts had bound him to that auction block. Her own past pressed against her, her mother's grave, her father's absence, the men who'd promised a homestead and left her with nothing but a name. Outside, the air was crisp, the sun not yet cruel. Jacob stopped by a trough, splashing water on his face, the droplets catching in his stubble like dew. "You got a plan?" he asked, his voice low, not quite looking at her. She clutched the letter, its ink smudged but still legible. "You're Jacob Wells," she said, not a question. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. "And you're the one who bought me. Don't mean you know me." She pulled the letter from her pocket, holding it out like a shield. "This says you're looking for a wife. A homestead. Was that a lie too?" He stared at the paper, his jaw working as if chewing on the words. "Wrote that a year ago," he said finally. "Before things went wrong. Land's gone now. So's the money." His voice was flat, but his eyes betrayed a deeper cut, a loss he didn't name. She felt her chest tighten, the hope she'd carried crumbling like the dirt under her boots. "Then why'd you answer?" she asked, her voice sharper than she meant. He looked away, toward the horizon, where the plains stretched endless and unforgiving. "Didn't expect anyone to show." The memory hit her like a gust of wind. Her mother, frail in her final days, pressing a locket into Eliza's hand. "Find someone who stays," she'd said, her voice a whisper of strength. Eliza had carried that locket across states, through betrayal, its weight a reminder of promises she refused to break. Now, standing before Jacob, she felt the locket's chain against her skin, a quiet anchor. He wasn't the man she'd imagined, but he was here, and that was something. They walked to the edge of town, where a preacher's shack leaned against a gnarled tree. The letter had promised marriage, a contract to bind them to a shared future. Eliza's heart thudded, not with love, but with the fear of another abandonment. Jacob's steps slowed, his hands flexing at his sides. "You don't owe me nothin'," he said, his voice rough. "I'll work off the $2. You can walk away." She shook her head, her fingers brushing the locket. "I didn't come this far to walk away." The preacher was old, his hands trembling as he read the vows. The words felt foreign, heavy with a promise neither fully believed. Jacob's hand was warm when he took hers, his grip firm but not possessive. The ring he slipped on her finger was a simple band, scavenged from his pocket, its metal dull but solid. Her throat tightened as she spoke her vows, each word a step into the unknown. When it was done, the preacher nodded, and the silence felt louder than the ceremony. They stepped outside, the wind carrying the scent of sage and earth, the world unchanged but heavier. Jacob paused, his eyes on the horizon again. "Got no land," he said. "But there's a place, few miles out. Not much, but it's shelter." She nodded, her hand still tingling from his touch. They were strangers, bound by a name and a vow, but the weight of it felt like a beginning, fragile and untested. The trail to Jacob's shelter was a scar across the plains, rutted by wheels and weathered hooves. Eliza's boots sank into the soft earth, each step heavier than the last, her shawl no match for the wind that bit through her. Jacob walked ahead, his stride long but uneven, as if the ground itself resisted him. The sky was a vast, unyielding gray, the kind that promised rain but held it back, taunting the cracked land below. Her fingers brushed the locket at her neck, its metal warm from her skin, a reminder of her mother's voice urging her forward. The ring on her finger felt foreign, too heavy for the vows it carried. The shelter came into view, a squat cabin, its logs weathered to a dull silver, half swallowed by sagebrush. A lean-to sagged against one side, sheltering a rusted plow and a pile of warped boards. Jacob stopped at the door, his hand lingering on the latch, as if weighing whether to let her in. "Ain't much," he said, his voice low, almost an apology. She nodded, her eyes tracing the roof's missing shingles, the way the wind whistled through the gaps. It was no homestead, but it was a roof, and she'd slept under worse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and damp earth. A single room, sparsely furnished, a table with one wobbly leg, a stove that looked more rust than iron, a cot in the corner with a threadbare blanket. Eliza's chest tightened, not from disappointment but from the familiarity of scarcity. She'd grown up in rooms like this, where every object bore the weight of survival. Jacob lit a lamp, its flicker casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. He didn't look at her, busying himself with the stove, his movements deliberate, as if afraid to disturb the fragile truce between them. She set her shawl on the table, her hands brushing the letter in her pocket. The words, "land to share, life to build," felt like a mockery now, but she couldn't let them go. "What happened to it?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "The land." Jacob's shoulders stiffened, his hands pausing over the kindling. "Bad season," he said finally. "Crops failed. Couldn't pay the bank. They took it all, land, stock, everything but this." He gestured at the room, his voice bitter but resigned. "Debts pile up when the rain don't come." Her mind drifted to her own losses, the way hope had been stripped from her piece by piece. The men who'd promised her a new start had taken her savings, her trust, leaving her with nothing but a name and a dollar. She looked at Jacob, his scar a map of his own defeats, and felt a kinship she hadn't expected. "You didn't run," she said, almost to herself. His eyes met hers, sharp and searching. "Neither did you." The memory came softly this time, not a blade but a whisper. Her mother, teaching her to sew by candlelight, her fingers guiding Eliza's clumsy stitches. "Every tear can be mended," she'd said, her smile tired but warm. Eliza had believed her then, had thought the world could be stitched back together. Now, standing in this broken cabin, she wasn't so sure. But Jacob's presence, solid and scarred, was a thread she could hold on to, if only for now. They ate a sparse meal, beans and a scrap of cornbread he'd found in a tin. The silence between them was less heavy now, softened by the act of sharing. She noticed the way his hands moved, careful but strong, as if he'd once built things worth keeping. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above the crackle of the stove. He leaned back, his chair creaking, and looked at her, not with answers, but with a question of his own. "You tell me. You're the one who bought me." She almost laughed, the sound catching in her throat. "Didn't buy you," she said. "Bought a chance." His lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the door, but the cabin held firm. It wasn't a home, not yet, but it was a start, a place where two broken things might find a way to mend. The days bled into one another, marked by the rhythm of survival. Eliza woke each morning to the sound of Jacob chopping wood, the axe's steady thwack echoing across the plains like a heartbeat. The cabin was a stubborn thing, leaking cold through its cracks, but she patched what she could with rags and stubbornness. Her hands, once soft from city work, grew calloused, the locket at her neck a constant weight against her skin. Jacob worked beside her in silence, hauling water from a creek that barely trickled, his scar catching the light as he moved. They were not yet partners, not quite strangers, but something in between, bound by necessity and the vows they'd spoken in that preacher's shack. The land around the cabin was unforgiving, its soil hard and stingy. Eliza knelt in the dirt one afternoon, clawing at it with a borrowed spade, trying to coax life from a patch of ground. Her mother's voice came to her again, unbidden, from a memory of planting beans in a tin bucket behind their tenement. "You give to the earth, it gives back," she'd said, her hands steady despite the cough that rattled her chest. Eliza's hands shook now, not from weakness but from doubt. The earth here seemed to want nothing but to break her. Jacob appeared, his shadow falling long across her work. He crouched beside her, silent, his hands resting on his knees. "Won't grow here," he said, his voice low, not cruel but certain. "Too dry." She wiped sweat from her brow, her fingers streaked with dirt. "Then why stay?" she asked, the question sharper than she meant. His eyes met hers, gray as the sky before a storm. "Ain't about the land anymore," he said. "It's about what's left." She didn't ask what he meant, but the word settled in her, heavy as the ring on her finger. That night, the wind howled fiercer, rattling the cabin's bones. Eliza sat by the stove, mending a tear in her shawl, her stitches uneven but holding. Jacob whittled a piece of wood, the knife's slow scrape a counterpoint to the storm outside. The memory came sharp this time, her father, not the drunk who left, but the man he'd been before, teaching her to whistle by a riverbank, his laugh warm as sunlight. She'd forgotten that laugh until now, and it cut deeper than his absence. She looked at Jacob, his face shadowed by the lamp's glow, and wondered what memories carved him. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, her voice soft, the needle pausing in her hand. He didn't look up, his knife still moving. "Every day," he said. "But running don't fix what's broken." His words hung in the air, mingling with the smoke from the stove. She nodded, not because she agreed, but because she understood. She'd run from her father's promises, from her mother's grave, only to find herself here, tethered to a man she barely knew. The next morning, a stranger rode up, his horse kicking up dust that stung Eliza's eyes. He was lean, his hat tipped low, a rifle slung across his back. "Wells," he called, his voice sharp as a whip. Jacob stepped outside, his hand resting on the doorframe, his body a barrier between Eliza and the man. "Bank's calling your debt," the rider said. "This place is next." Eliza's heart sank, the cabin's fragile hold slipping away. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. The rider smirked, reining his horse around. "You got a week." When the dust settled, Jacob turned to her, his eyes dark with something she couldn't name. "You should go," he said. "Ain't nothing here worth staying for." Her chest tightened, the locket burning against her skin. She thought of her mother, of the letter, of the $1 she'd spent on a chance. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice steady despite the fear. "Not yet." His gaze softened, just for a moment, before he turned away, his boots heavy on the cabin floor. They worked harder that week, patching the roof, shoring up the walls, as if they could hold back the bank's claim with their hands. Eliza's muscles ached, but the work grounded her, each nail driven a defiance against the world's indifference. Jacob's silence grew heavier, but his hands brushed hers more often, passing a hammer, steadying a board, small gestures that felt like a language they were learning together. The week passed like a fever, each day hotter, heavier, the threat of the bank's claim pressing down like the sun. Eliza's hands blistered from the hammer, her shoulders aching from hauling stones to shore up the cabin's foundation. Jacob worked beside her, his movement steady but his eyes distant, as if he were already preparing to lose what little they had. The plains stretched around them, vast and indifferent, the sagebrush trembling in a wind that carried no mercy. Her locket felt heavier each day, its chain a quiet reminder of her mother's words, "Find someone who stays." But staying, she was learning, was a choice that cut deeper than leaving. The night before the deadline, they sat by the stove, the fire's glow casting long shadows. Eliza's fingers traced the worn edges of the letter, now folded and refolded so many times it felt like cloth. Jacob whittled, his knife carving a small, shapeless figure from a scrap of wood. The silence between them was no longer empty but filled with unspoken questions. She wanted to ask about the scar, the debts, the man he'd been before the auction block. Instead, she said, "What happens tomorrow?" He paused, the knife still in his hand. "They'll come," he said, his voice low, rough as the wind outside. "Take the cabin, the land, whatever's left." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw fear there, not for himself but for her. "You don't have to stay for this." Her throat tightened, the weight of her choice settling in her chest. She thought of her father, his promises dissolving into the dust of a road he never returned down. She thought of her mother, sewing hope into every stitch. "I'm not running," she said, her voice steady. "Not from this." The memory came softly, like the first drops of rain. Her mother, singing a hymn in the dark, her voice frail but unbroken, filling their tiny room with warmth. Eliza had clung to that sound, even after the fever took her, carrying it across the plains like a talisman. Now, in this cabin, with Jacob's quiet presence across from her, she felt that warmth again, fragile but real. She reached for the locket, her fingers brushing its worn surface, and made a choice, not to hope, but to endure. Morning came, and with it, the sound of hooves. 3 men rode up, their shadows long and sharp against the dawn. The leader was the same rider from before, his smirk unchanged, his rifle glinting in the early light. "Time's up, Wells," he called, dismounting with a swagger. Jacob stood in the doorway, his hands steady but empty. Eliza stepped beside him, her heart pounding, the locket a quiet weight against her chest. The men's eyes flicked to her, their smirks faltering at the steel in her gaze. "You got nothing left to take," Jacob said, his voice calm but unyielding. The leader laughed, but it was hollow. "We'll see about that." He moved toward the cabin, but Eliza stepped forward, her hands clenched. "This is ours," she said, the words surprising her with their force. "You'll have to drag us out." The men hesitated, their confidence shaken by her defiance. Jacob's hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that steadied her. The standoff stretched, the air thick with dust and tension. Then, from the distance, a low rumble, more hooves, a wagon. A man emerged, older, his face weathered but kind, a ledger in his hand. "Hold on," he called, his voice cutting through the silence. He was a surveyor, sent by the bank to assess the land. He dismounted, his eyes taking in the cabin, the patched roof, the stones Eliza had laid. "This place ain't worth the trouble," he said, scribbling in his ledger. "Bank's writing it off." The riders grumbled but rode off, their shadows shrinking into the horizon. Eliza's knees trembled, but she held her ground, Jacob's presence solid beside her. The surveyor tipped his hat and left, the wagon's creak fading into the quiet. They stood there, the cabin still theirs, the land still stubborn but theirs too. The sun climbed higher, its light softer now, touching the sagebrush with a glow that felt like grace. Eliza's hand found the locket, her fingers tracing its familiar shape. The world hadn't changed, but she had, and so had he. The dust still stung her eyes, but it carried a promise now, faint as the hawk's cry that lingered in the air.